cyber age. The next guest was the Honorable Randall Ford, who had been Assistant Secretary at State Department's Intelligence Service, but also had been the head of security for Goldman Sachs, and then in turn a very senior person at the Raytheon Corporation in the cyber arena, and a continuing advisor to the Director of National Intelligence on any number of cyber issues, the least of which was how to effectively use this for decision-making by senior leaders. We've also now had Stephanie Pell, who is a senior counsel both out of the Justice Department and is now up at West Point, where she is one of the leaders in the Army cyber unit up there, and looking at law and international law. We again have entered in very different times. We are without borders and boundaries here, but yet we are with rules and regulations. So Stephanie had a good shot in terms of trying to explain that to us all, a very difficult explanation. Last week, we had Dr. Mark Lowenthal, who is the gold standard in terms of intelligence analysis. He is the expert on the subject, almost hands down, but he was also a pioneer in open source. One of the first people, even back in the 1990s, to recognize that as the cyber age began, in fact, that information would be available that could be used by people that wasn't necessarily classified, where we were worrying about sources and methods of collection and all that that entails. So now we're leading to today's guest. This is a woman who is in herself an open source intelligence agency. She is a targeter, she is a collector, she is a writer and editor of information, and she is a presenter of that fact to the world. Allow me to welcome Jenna McLaughlin. She's a national security correspondent for Yahoo News. And Yahoo, at this point, I just looked it up, Jenna, you'll be happy to know, was the most widely read news service in the world for the last 6 months, 3.5 billion visits in the last 6 months. You've done a fantastic job. See, there you go.
Sounds like my job is safe.
your job is safe. She's a 2014 graduate of Johns Hopkins, and she's covered intelligence and news and security world for CNN, for Foreign Policy Magazine, for Intercept, for Mother Jones. Welcome. Thank you for taking the time. This is not a very easy time for any of us. So I really appreciate you taking a few moments to talk to the students and talk to the other people here who are listening to us today. Let me just go right up front. What I usually try to do in these sessions is talk a little bit about someone's career up front to give people a little idea about how you got there. So how did a nice person like you want to get into this nasty newspaper information business? What led you there? And you talk a little bit about your career and how you got to Yahoo.
It's a great question. So I think more generally getting into the news and writing business, I had always enjoyed writing and reading. I grew up in a household full of thousands of books easily. The shelves that my dad didn't fit all of the books that we had, so they'd be stacked in front of the shelves. So I think that my desire to be a writer sort of came from my love of reading. And by the time I was in school, I was interested in a lot of things. It was hard to sort of narrow down. But at Johns Hopkins, where I was an undergrad, the Writing Seminars program, which is focused primarily on creative writing, but has a nonfiction track, it sort of encourages you to do classes in international studies and literature and things like that. And I knew that I wanted to do journalism probably around my junior year. And for me, I didn't know what that would look like necessarily. I just knew I enjoyed telling people stories. And I thought that, I do really like writing creatively. And I had initially thought that maybe I would be an author, perhaps. And that's certainly still a possibility. But I sort of realized that there were just so many real stories out there that are begging to be told, some of them hidden, honestly. And that's been sort of my passion since really getting into investigative journalism, is getting those stories that aren't told, whether that's because the people who are at the center of them don't have their own voice to sort of get them out there, or because they're hidden for certain reasons, for embarrassment or whatever that might be, and the American people deserve to know more about them. So that's sort of the beginning stages of that.
Where did you find the first job? Where was the first one out the door where someone looked at you and said, Jenna, we want you?
Sure. So the week after I graduated, I got a call from Mother Jones for their fellowship, and decided to accept that offer and move to DC a week after graduating. So it's been a whirlwind since then.
What did they have you covering?
So at Mother Jones, the fellowship focuses initially and primarily on fact checking. So you really understand sort of the basics of the business. Actually, Mother Jones is one of the only places that has all of their online pieces fact checked, which is astounding in this day and age, just given the pure volume that comes out. Like other news organizations just don't have the capacity to do that. It falls largely on the journalists themselves. And there are always things that you don't catch. And sometimes the copy editors catch them and that sort of thing. But because I was fact checking and reading all of my colleagues' work, I sort of got the chance to not only understand the process of reporting, but get interested in these different subjects. And I was thinking to myself, you know, the staff right now has so much expertise in all these different areas, but we don't have people really covering national security. And I'm interested in that. You know, I did international studies in college. I think that it's interesting. And, you know, the editor-in-chief, David Korn, had famously covered the Iraq War and lots of these different subjects. So I said to myself, if I start covering these issues, you know, I'll hopefully get the attention of editors. I'll get some individual time with them, and I'll be able to cover some interesting things. So that was around the time of the rise of ISIS. So I was able to sort of marry my skills with social media as one of the younger people on staff. I was on Twitter. I was tracking things going on Twitter kind of before the rest of my colleagues were. And I united that with kind of propaganda, terrorist use of social media. So it ended up being a unique subject for me that I was able to kind of contribute to, even though I didn't have that much experience.
So this eventually led you to Yahoo, and a question I guess I would ask, of course, is, you know, for those of us who are a little older, Yahoo was, you know, yahoo.com, and that was your email. And news seemed to come in almost secondarily, as it often did in these organizations, and became then of enormous importance. It's really two questions on this one, you know, in terms of how did you get to Yahoo, but also describe a little bit what Yahoo is, Yahoo News is. I mean, the idea that you have 3.5 billion hits within 6 months is pretty impressive. And it's obviously, I think it's number 6 in the US, number 1 worldwide. That's pretty impressive stuff. If you talk a little bit about how you got there, but also what you do there in the sense of what Yahoo News is all about.
Sure. Yeah. So I joined Yahoo. It's been a year and a half, I think now at this point, and time really flies. And it's an interesting place because Yahoo News fits within the broader company Yahoo, like you mentioned, and it's owned by Verizon. So it's really this massive place, but there are small units within it. So it's easy to sort of exist within your own corner of the organization. And because of how large it is, because of the connections we have to the Yahoo homepage, because of all the partners we have, we actually pull content from partners, including the New York Times, the AP, Daily Beast. We have all of that generating through our systems, and therefore we've got a lot of eyeballs coming to our website, which is really great because the journalists who are here doing their own originals sort of get to feed off of all of that energy, and we get all these readers, and it's a really fantastic system, especially for somebody like me who is definitely happy to sort of write some breaking news, some stories that are quicker turnaround, but I also just really enjoy having the time to sort of dig into something more investigative. And the fact that we just have so much to draw from on our homepage gives me a little bit more freedom to do that.
What's your portfolio in the sense of not only the area that you're looking at, but when you're looking for a story? I mean, some is push, I guess, some is pull, some comes in your lap. One day you're sitting at home writing about COVID-19. The next day maybe there's something that's come across your desk, or some issue that you've come up with or thought about. So you talk a little bit about that process of you as sort of targeter, you as analyst, and you as the writer. How does that work for you?
Sure. So I think it's juggling a lot of balls, keeping them in the air at the same time. Any given day, while days resemble themselves in quarantine, oftentimes that's not the case. You know, oftentimes I'll be out meeting people, you know, for lunches and dinners and drinks, and I'll be traveling to conferences and doing all sorts of things to not only report specific stories that I already have in mind, but just to make contacts and to talk to smart people and get a sense of what's on their mind and what they think is important, what's perhaps being ignored, whether there's something that, you know, they think is not currently existing in the whole media ecosphere that needs to be focused on. Sometimes that's kind of how I generate ideas, and most of the time it's me that's coming up with ideas. In a time like right now with coronavirus, I'm trying to sort of take my skills, my source base, my connection to national security, and marry those subjects in a way that makes sense. So looking at what role would the intelligence community play in responding to a pandemic? That's an interesting question and probably not one that immediately comes to people's minds. So then you start thinking about, okay, who is tasked with that? Turns out there's a very small unit within the DIA, that's the National Center for Medical Intelligence, and actually they've been doing this for a long time. So it ends up being really interesting being able to bring those skills I already have to breaking news. And then in other moments when I have sort of a moment of peace, I can go back to maybe something that's longer and investigative and that I've got on my desk for months, if not more than that.
Which, by the way, is very typically what an analyst does too. In fact, if you're dealing with the CIA analyst or DI, what you find yourself doing is short-term stuff, and then with a little bit of sort of longer-term stuff. Let me go back to your case officer part, though, because I must admit, when one of the things that you learn over time as a case officer is how to sort of develop people, how you meet people, and so you talk a little bit about that in terms of when you're meeting with some guy with a white beard somewhere, at a point in time. How do you frame that relationship? Because as you know, in Washington, that can get a little sticky sometimes in terms of people either trusting each other or feeling comfortable in terms of talking, or also in terms of just trying to get the information out of them. Sometimes people don't know what they know.
Right, exactly. I think that's an interesting question. And honestly, it depends, which I think I've heard that from a lot of intelligence officers. The answer is always, it depends. I think it depends not only on who that person is, but also how they sort of perceive me as a young woman, as a journalist, an investigative journalist. When somebody's sort of looking at me, I want them to consider me sort of a safe place to bring information. It depends on whether or not that person wants to tell their story, if they think that there's something really important that needs to be exposed. If somebody wants me to sort of just generally understand a subject area or the way that an organization functions so that I don't make mistakes, people sometimes have that motivation. So you sort of just get them talking about the bureaucracy and the minutia, and you end up learning a lot and being able to frequently go back to them and say, well, there's this story about the way that NSA collects on this. Like, does it actually work that way? Could you help me walk through that? Does this actually make sense technically and otherwise? So I think, like a case officer, you're analyzing each of those relationships individually. Sometimes you're going to come across a person who has absolutely no interest in you ever, and maybe you just move on. But more often than not, you encounter folks who want to be helpful in the ways that they can, and you sort of just continue to work on that. And something I tell young journalists a lot is that being transactional is never going to work for you in the long term. Right. There's plenty of journalists who will call people, berate them, try to get information out of them, or they'll only talk to someone when they need something. And for me, that's just not how you treat humans, or if you want to continue to have a long-lasting relationship with that person, but also a long-lasting career in Washington. People talk. And a lot of the time for me, maybe I'll have a conversation with somebody and it won't come to anything. I won't write anything about it, and that's fine. 6 months later, that person says, hey, I'm on this really interesting listserv, and I came across an email that I thought that you would find interesting because of this conversation we had about whatever subject it was. And because they remembered me and they remembered the questions I asked, the interest I expressed in them, maybe I'll get a really good story out of that. Who knows?
Yeah,
sometimes
absolutely.
It doesn't lead to anything.
When you're doing a story and you've got multiple sources on that story, well, let me just ask the question then: how do you balance off those sources? How do you mix and match? Everybody's got a bit of an angle sometimes, or they're a limited amount of knowledge about a subject, and they're perhaps being more expansive on it than they should be. Over the years when I've dealt with people, I've always tried to say, look, this is sort of what I know and what I don't know, but you and I also know that that's not always the case. How do you judge those sources? How do you sort of mix and match when you're sitting down to write a story?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So I think you need to sort of approach each person individually and say, all right, how are they positioned? What is their network? What is their access to information? How far removed are they from that information? And then work from there. And I think also, what is their motivation in talking to me in the first place? Is this someone new who's come to me who might have a political motivation, or maybe they'll get somebody some extra money from Congress, or they'll expose somebody that they don't like personally? That's not necessarily a deal breaker in terms of someone providing information. People come to journalists for all sorts of reasons. But I think when you have instances like that, you need to balance it with a range of additional folks to sort of get to that center place where there's a factual ground truth, or as close to it as you can get. Because relying on one person, of course, you are seeing it through their binoculars, their lens. You might be missing the broader focus, or you might be not understanding a piece of context or something like that, because that person can only know what that person knows. So I think more people, and just evaluating like which pieces of this can I chip away, and get the sense that, oh, well, this person's mad about this thing. Their personal grudge is not important, but this piece of information that they provided might have some factual truth to it. So how can I get at the deeper story of that piece of information?
How do you see news? I mean,
sorry, how do I what?
How do you see fake news? I mean, in the sense of there's a lot of it out there, and you see it all, and we all do every day. But I'm just kidding, because you've got a good set of instincts at this point. How you?
Yeah, I think that honestly, I've just been trained to be incredibly skeptical, and understand when something is probably very unlikely. And the only times that I'll sort of consider something that's highly unlikely is when somebody I trust tells me that thing, and I'll say, okay, well, previously I had not considered that, but you've demonstrated your credentials, you're somebody I already trust, and maybe I'll look into it. But I mean, working for The Intercept, you immediately have this instinct to say, can't be true, someone's hiding something, or something like that. And sometimes that goes too far, but it is a good skill to have to be able to evaluate information.
It must be hard to watch the news sometimes. As someone I mean, I'm sure you're sitting there thinking, judging. Well, what do you do? I mean, if you're sitting there listening to the news in the evening, are you an Olympic judge? You're sort of holding up, no, that was 9.5. We sort of like that one. Nah, I wouldn't have written it that way, etc. I wouldn't have said it that way.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that happens. For me, in terms of TV news and things like that, I don't consume as much of that as others might, just because I feel like oftentimes just because you have to fill 24 hours, and at the same time, each of these snippets are incredibly short. Opinion enters into that a lot. You have panels, people yelling at each other, and sometimes I just don't find that all that productive in terms of just gathering new pieces of information. When I'm looking at news stories, whether it's from the Times or the Post or any number of other outlets, I sort of look at that and say, okay, where do I think this is coming from? Who do I think their sources are? Not in terms of like, what are their names, but which area do I feel like this is coming from? And does that change my perception of how accurate the story is? There have certainly been times where I'll look at a story and I'll say, this seems to me like it comes from a politician for whatever reason. And because of that, I have the certain lens on my eyeglasses, and I'm saying, okay, well, this congressman would have a big interest in making this person look bad in order to elevate their profile. Does that make this story slightly skewed? Sometimes I think yes. And, I'm very hesitant to sort of go out and necessarily say that publicly, because I respect all of my colleagues in the news. I think that journalists are all on the same team at the end of the day, and I really do believe that. And I very often will help my colleagues at other papers if they ask me to. I think that that's important. But you do end up sort of looking through that and saying, okay, where do I think this is coming from? Is there space for me to actually provide more on this story?
Yeah, because I really wanted to say it in terms of your colleagues or those people who are younger than you at this point, in terms of how they should look at news and how do you want them to read your stuff when you're writing? How do you want them to?
So I think
besides it's great, of course, obviously.
Well, exactly. I'd love them to share everything and tweet all of my stories, but I think what I would really like them to do is read it and say, okay, what questions do I still have? What questions remain unanswered in this story? And no single story can answer every question you have. Even books can't do that. I mean, if you go far reaching enough on any subject, there's still going to be remaining questions.
Oh,
So,
the more you know about an area, as well, no, this is miserable sometimes. People always ask me what my favorite spy book is, and I look at them like I can't even begin to start because
I can't narrow it down.
I can't read it. I'll look at it, but I can't read it because I know what the holes are. I know where people have let stuff out.
Yes. As a journalist, for me, honestly, that has made things difficult because now my instinct as a reporter is to say, okay, well, I just need one more interview to make sure I understand this piece of it, or it's not ready yet because I don't feel like I have the full context here. And, that can be frustrating for editors who really want the story out quickly. I try to balance those two things.
Let me talk about those nasty people. Shelby Coffey, who was the editor for the LA Times, is going to be the last guest on this show. And Shelby and I've had a lot of conversations over the years about editing and spiking stories and whatever else. When you're working a story at this point, can you talk a little bit about that process of working with the editor? Some obviously more challenging than others, but what are you looking forward to sort of to sell the story, to convince the editor, hey, this is a good idea?
Sure. So it totally depends on the editor. Like you get a sense of what things they find really interesting, what pieces of your story to pull out that will convince them that it's going to be interesting, whether that means, I have this piece of news that no one else has that relates to the White House or the CIA or something like that. And you say, oh, that sounds really interesting. That sounds catchy. Like, let's pursue that. I think with editors that you've worked with for a long time, there is a level of trust built in there that they'll say, okay, well, I have experience with Jenna's work. I know that when she feels like she's got a bone that she thinks is going to be interesting, I'll at least let her pursue that for a couple days. And then we'll check back in and see what comes back in terms of substantial reporting. So I've been lucky in my career that I've had a lot of excellent editors that I've worked with that have given me a bit of a leash to go off and explore. And sometimes it doesn't come back. Sometimes I have a question and I'm not able to answer it. And then, you sort of dust off and move on, which is okay, but can be really frustrating.
What is the day like? My impression now is from friends in your business that in fact it's a lot of Twitter. It's a lot of attempting to get at least smaller, shorter stories out during the day, and some frustration in terms of working longer stories. What's when Jenna's not being held captive with her cats in her home? What's the story? What's the day look like for you?
You broke up a little bit there, but
what's the day look like for you in terms of how, because there's a lot of requirement, I guess, of doing instant Twitter. There's a lot of requirement of trying to get other stories out while you're working on the big one. Can you talk just sort of a little bit about what your day might look like? A typical day, I guess.
Yeah, sure. So like I mentioned in previous worlds, some days I would have 2 or 3 source meetings scheduled, and in between that I'd be on the phone, or I'd be in a meeting with editors, or I'd be answering emails, or I'd be sort of working my Signal chats. Now that's sort of restricted to the things that I can do from my own apartment, which makes it a little bit more challenging. But I think it's interesting to note the social media side of it too. Journalists, I think, have become kind of their own brand ambassadors, if you will. The Twitter is part of the job, promoting yourself is part of the job. And I think, honestly, I have gotten jobs or gotten noticed in a lot of cases because I've been good with using Twitter, and I have a fairly large following. I'm not sure what it is at this moment, but tens of thousands of people read my tweets every day, which blows my mind. You have to start to think about it, to be like, do these tens of thousands of people want to see my cats read my stories?
That's also a question, given the fact you have a limited number of characters there. That also, I would assume, requires a lot of editing as well to get.
Yes, more characters than a headline, though, which is nice. Headlines are the bane of my existence because they're never long enough to be complex and nuanced, and that drives me crazy. And that's probably one of the things that is hardest for me is arriving at a headline that I feel like is interesting but also accurate. So that sometimes occupies 30 minutes or an hour of the day is figuring out what the headline's going to be for a story once it's already done.
What do you see in terms of your colleagues at this point? There's a whole generation of you now coming up, and they're obviously people who are more savvy in terms of social media, et cetera. And I guess the question I would ask is what you just hit on a little bit is what does your online presence now need to be?
Sure.
How do you actually sit and work with say people at Yahoo and say, all right, here's what I need to put out, or have you pretty much done that on your own? Or what's the in the old days it would have been considered public relations. What's the PR of you now in terms
Sure.
of
So I think,
about
yeah, every organization, including Yahoo, has standards for social media behavior that you're meant to follow. Essentially, be the journalist that we expect you to be, put out unbiased content, leave the opinions at the door. But, feel free to interact with readers, to push out your stories, to maybe, cite a couple things that you think were interesting that you didn't get the chance to write about. And I think that's a great part for me, is that sometimes, there was a piece of information or something I noticed about an event or something like that, that I'll say, hey, this is interesting. And I might not immediately write about it. But the fact that I've tweeted that out makes people notice that it's something that I'm paying attention to and that I'm interested in and I'm engaged. And I think one thing that I did find really valuable at my time at The Intercept is that something that Glenn Greenwald cared a lot about was engaging with readers and answering their questions and making them feel like they've been heard. And sometimes there's not value in that if someone is just being a sexist troll. Like somebody called me today and screamed at me and said that I was an enemy of the people and lots of other nasty things. And perhaps that's not the most productive reader to engage in. But there are many smart people reading my stories who they deserve to converse with the person who's providing them information, and maybe they'll think of a question that I haven't thought of before. So I do enjoy having that level of interaction with social media. That's something you wouldn't necessarily get.
Yeah, I was gonna say even 10 years ago was tough. I mean, you get someone sending a note in or a letter in or whatever else, but it always struck me as though that you guys are really, in a lot of ways, sort of on the front line in the trenches. That in fact you can lob a grenade over, but you have 10 of them sort of coming back. What's we're sort of in the final minutes here, as you are looking forward now, and I know this is always tough. Where do you think that this area, this journalism now goes? I mean, we're now increasingly overwhelmed by information. You are now in many ways your own star in terms of being a journalist and having to promote yourself. Where do you see this going next? I mean, in terms of your own career, where do you see yourself? I'll say 10 years because that's just the obligatory line, 10 years. Yeah. But where do you see yourself going over the next few years? Not just personally, but in terms of the business itself.
The business, yeah, that's a great question. Probably the $1 million question is, how is our business going to continue to sustain itself and make money and get people to read and care about news and pay for that news? And I think that question is still very much an open one. And if I figure it out, then I probably get paid more than I currently do. That makes sense. But I think
job waiting for you.
What I would love to see is some level of sort of local news resurface. Investment in investigative journalism. I think it needs to be done. It's a public service. There are certain outlets that are really good with it, like ProPublica, many others come to mind. But what I would love to be in a position to do is to continue to write some of the investigative stories that I do, but also have written books, right?
Absolutely.
Be potentially an editor, because I think that the lessons that I've learned and the relationships that I've had with my editors have made me understand just how important that is. And I would love to be able to sort of provide that service to the next generation of journalists whenever that point and time comes. And, at the end of the day, reporting gets tiring. It really does. It's a slog. And I don't know if I'll be able to sort of run at the same pace forever. So perhaps that's where I'll be, but hopefully the industry will be healthier.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so too. The parallels, by the way, and thanks for helping draw these out, between what someone does to produce intelligence and what you do on a daily basis are so exact. I can't begin to tell you.
Yeah, I honestly have people tell me that all the time. They're like, our jobs are extremely similar, but you just have a different audience. We have different customers. So
yeah, that's it. Really, honestly, Jenna, that's it too. I mean, in terms of just doing the day-to-day stuff. Well, listen, I wanted to thank you very much for taking your time. I know this is not the easiest of time for anybody to take their time out to come to visit us and to talk a little bit. And I'm sure both on Facebook as well as on the Dole side, we'd like to thank you very, very much for coming today. As I close this on down, I again want to thank the Dole Institute for their great support and patience throughout this whole process. It really is greatly appreciated, and above and beyond, the staff there have done a wonderful job. Next week, on Wednesday the 15th, we will have Dr. Greg Treverton, who is the chairman of the National Intelligence Council, as well as a very senior person at the RAND Corporation, and who is a futurist and wants to talk a little bit with us on the subject, not just of intelligence, but how the information age has now affected the political and economic structures that we've all grown up with. Greg's premise, and I think a fairly good one, is that what we've lived in for the last 75 years is not what we're going to be living in here within the next decade. So he's going to talk about that, talk about how policymakers deal with the tremendous volume of information coming at them, and what difference that makes in terms of providing information, useful information to the policymaker, whether or not they be in the private sector or the public. So again, I want to thank everybody for coming. Jenna, again, thank you so much for taking your time. To the Dole Institute, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope to see you next week. Take care and be safe out there.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.